Okay, 7 o'clock, June 16, 2025. Welcome everyone to the June Arizona Archaeological Society lecture. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Huster. She's going to be talking about the conquest of the Toluca Valley. She's a co-worker of mine. She's the original PI at Chronicle Heritage. So we're very excited to have her here today. With that being said, Angela, Dr. Huster, you can go ahead and take over the screen. Oh, one thing before I forget. If you have any questions, she's going to answer those questions at the end of the lecture. So if you can write them in the chat section, and then when she's done, she'll go through the questions. So thank you, and here's Dr. Huster.
Hi, I'm happy to be here with everybody tonight, and I hope you guys enjoy hearing about some research in the Toluca Valley of central Mexico over the past, at this point, well over 10 years. I'll be talking about two different projects this evening, one at Kish Lawaka, which formed a large part of my dissertation research, and then a more recent one at a site called Teotihuacan. So I will go ahead and give you some visuals to go with that. So the first thing I generally get asked is, where is the Toluca Valley? Because even among archaeologists who work in Mexico, it's not the most common area. The teams I've worked with have been pretty much the only foreign teams I'm aware of that work in the region. And when I try and explain that I work in Toluca to just about anyone, including other Mexicans, they tend to give me very strange looks and say, well, why would you work there? Because in Mexico, Toluca is known for two things. It's bad weather because it rains all the time, and it's sausage, chorizo sausage. I will say both of these are accurate. It rains a lot, and the chorizo is really good. But more practically, the Toluca Valley is the next major drainage over from the Basin of Mexico in central Mexico. So you have the Basin of Mexico where modern Mexico City is, and then you go and was the heart of the Teotihuacan, the Toltec, and then the Aztec empires. And if you go up and over the hills to the west, it takes about an hour, hour and a half in a car today. You could have walked it in a day in the past. You end up in the Toluca Valley. The Toluca Valley is the headwaters of the Lerma River, which ties together much of West Mexico. And because of that, it really sits on a cultural boundary between Central and West Mexico and pivots back and forth over time. For a brief outline of what I'll be going over today, I'll do a general background on the Aztec Empire because we are working a little further afield than I think the topics for these presentations often do. A little bit of background on what people have proposed about Aztec rulership, a bit about the Toluca Valley in general, and then some on each of the two projects. For our initial housekeeping before we get started, Aztec can mean a few different things. One of them is a general catch-all term for people living in central Mexico after about 1200 CE AD, which is a term that archaeologists have largely invented because these people did not have a collective term for themselves. Their primary identity would have been to their city-state. The second meaning is as the Aztec Empire, or the Triple Alliance, a confederation of three cities. And the third is as the Mexica ethnic group, who ruled the main one of those three cities. So through the course of this presentation, I will try and use Aztec peoples or Aztec cultures when I mean the first, Triple Alliance or Aztec Empire when I mean the second, and Mexica when I mean the third. Our chronological background for this presentation starts about 1100 or a little thereafter. At this point, immigrants have moved into the Basin of Mexico from areas to the north, have founded the sets of city-states that would become the Aztec Empire, and really what we consider Aztec culture or Aztec peoples are present in the area. This is often referred to as the early Aztec or the middle post-classic period. By the mid-1300s, you've moved into what is called the late post-classic period, which is characterized by the foundation of Tenochtitlan, which would go on to become the main Aztec capital, and the foundation of two predecessor mini empires in the Basin of Mexico that laid a lot of the groundwork for the way the Aztec Empire functioned. The late post-classic, the late Aztec period is often divided in half and referred to as late Aztec A and B periods. In provincial areas like the Toluca Valley that I'll be talking about today, this distinction is used to tell apart the periods before and after the Aztec Empire conquers an area. So I've also included the Toluca Valley phase names here, which are the Dongu phase for the early Aztec period, the Nanupi phase for the late Aztec period, first half of the late Aztec period, and the Yata phase for the second half of the late Aztec period. These could broadly be thought of as the period before the Aztec Empire existed, the period when it existed but hadn't conquered the Toluca Valley yet, and the period after which the Toluca Valley had been conquered by the Aztec Empire, the Triple Alliance, and had become part of the empire. It is then followed by the Spanish conquest, at which point it becomes part of the Spanish Empire in the New World, and they see yet another major set of social transformations. Our major events here include the founding of Tenochtitlan, which is the core of modern Mexico City, in 1325. Tenochtitlan is really a latecomer to the Basin of Mexico, as various Nahua groups migrated into the Basin of Mexico. They collaborated with previous peoples there, intermarried, and founded a series of city-states. The Mexica were one of the last groups to arrive, and therefore ended up in definitely second-class lands on a rocky island, well, half rocky and half swampy island in the middle of the lake, and really spent a lot of their early history selling themselves out as mercenaries to other city-states. Within this context, you had the two predecessor states to the Aztec Empire, the Tepanec and the Acolhua empires, who were really competing back and forth for control of the Basin of Mexico. And the Aztecs, the Mexica, really played them off each other to form the Triple Alliance. So by 1428, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, three major city-states in the Basin of Mexico, formed a confederation and conquered most of the rest of the Basin of Mexico. From there, they began spreading out to conquer other areas of central Mexico and eventually much of the rest of Mesoamerica. as you can see here, each successive emperor, and we use the rulers of Tenochtitlan as the emperors of the Aztec Empire, despite the fact they were the rulers of one of three of the involved city-states. Over time, Tenochtitlan increasingly became the lead partner in the Triple Alliance. And by the time the Spanish arrived, really did largely control it. This is a remarkable degree of territorial expansion in about 90 years. The Toluca Valley, did not mark that on there. The Toluca Valley is about here, so they got there about halfway through their dynastic process. And it was one of the first times that they really had to deal with dramatically ethnically different people. Central Mexico is quite ethnically and linguistically diverse, but most of the early conquests of the Aztec Empire were other Nahuatl-speaking groups. And there was more shared cultural background. In this regard, the Toluca Valley served as one of the test cases for figuring out how you were going to, or how the Aztec Empire was going to rule a much more culturally different set of people and what the empire was going to be. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be talking about empires and the way states, or really any type of government or leadership functions. And two of the aspects we can look at are the directness of rule, which is how much does the state leave local power in place and rule indirectly? Do they leave the local nobility in place, or do they replace them with military governors? Perhaps today, what is the balance of power between the federal and the state government? This can be seen archaeologically as evidence of state presence in provincial areas, such as state architecture, capitol buildings, and standardized weights and coinage, evidence of the imposition of state practices in provincial areas. The other aspect of rulership we can look at is the collectiveness of rule, which is more broadly how accountable rulers are to their subjects, largely due to their political economy. So the more dependent a state is on internal finance, the more they have to keep their taxable population happy, either by limiting their how much they tax or by providing goods and services in return. So if you're primarily dependent on, say, grain taxes from your own population, as opposed to taxes on trade from an outside population, you have your local population has different degrees of leverage. These are traditionally discussed both in archaeology and more broadly in terms of actions of the elites. And this becomes a bit of a problem because I am a household archaeologist and I don't look at the temples and pyramids all that much, which meant that one of the things I had to do moving into this project was to think about how these types of rulership would turn up in commoner households. How would they be reflected in the bulk of the population? And some of the things we can look for in terms of the directness of rule are the degree of access to goods from other parts of the empire. How much is the presence of the empire facilitating trade and a single unified economic system? And this has consequences such as the changes in the degree of craft production and changes in the degree of adoption of imperial practices. And more broadly, you can think of it as being measurable in the magnitude of change under imperial rule. And this might be positive economic change, it might be negative economic change, but indirect rule where the empire is largely staying out of local business as long as people pay their taxes isn't going to produce much of a change in either direction. For our other variable here, looking at the collectiveness of rule, you can look at the development of market networks that have broad benefits to the population as opposed to more restricted patronage networks. Because one of the aspects of the collectiveness of rule is whether it is power by inclusion. With more collective rule, you have power because you are one of many and people buy in behind you, or if it is collective power via exclusion, you have power because you are different and special. This comes with some side effects of whether we're looking for independent or attached specialists, how elite controlled are the production of restricted items, and how shared are state and household practices. So is the state setting itself apart that elites or certain people in society have exclusive knowledge that is not shared, as opposed to trying to get people to buy into, say, the state religion or the national identity? This can to some extent be looked at as the direction of economic change, where you would expect market development to generally have a positive influence on economic growth and the degree of craft production and specialization. You can also look at it in the distribution of changes among households. How widespread are those networks of either economic or cultural change within the population? Are they reaching most people? Is it a very broad strategy, or are they limited to very targeted people? And within that framework of looking at the directness and the collectiveness of rule, we can stop and think about some of the models people have proposed for Aztec rulership in particular. I like to start by ruling out the bloodthirsty, sacrifice-happy maniacs theory. The perhaps traditional or stereotypical historical view of the Aztec Empire as being driven by a religious desire for captives to sacrifice is pretty thoroughly debunked. But I still get questions about it, so I am going to cover it here. So one, the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican people certainly did practice human sacrifice, but it occurs primarily in two types of contexts. It occurs during periods of extreme political instability and migration, so the in-between periods between states, which are, no matter whose society you're in, are periods, tend to be periods of increased violence. And the other time it occurs is largely in the capitals of large states as a show of power, of state power. Where you don't see it it occurs, but not in particularly high frequencies, is sort of in the predecessor states to the Aztec Empire, or in many of the city-states outside of the capitals of the empire, which, if this was a broad spread social belief, you would expect to see it both before the empire and much more widely spread among cities in the empire, which strongly suggests that it's not the driving force. they have cause and effect backwards on that one, that human sacrifice was a result of the empire and not a cause of it, a political strategy the empire adopted. The second model sometimes gets referred to as the mafia model, which is the idea of an indirect and low collective Aztec empire. So basically, they show up, their armies threaten you, threaten to sack your city if you don't pay your taxes every year, but otherwise leave you alone. It's the shakedown racket. They don't provide much. You're just not getting sacked. There's no particular impetus to develop integrated market systems. There's no impetus to develop a unified culture. And this really from the 80s through the mid-2000s was the primary model for the Aztec Empire. Yes, they were an empire, but they were a very light touch empire. The primary issue with this model is it does not explain the degree of economic integration we see within the Aztec Empire through its growth. That you really, once you know what you're looking for, you can see the economic footprint of the Aztec Empire, both in terms of the goods traded and changes to economic production within the footprint of the empire, which is pretty impressive because in some places that's seen a 50-year or less chronological period in a region that doesn't have tree ring dating. One of the more recent models is the idea that it is sort of intermediately direct. By the time the Spanish arrived, about a third of the provinces of the Aztec Empire were actually ruled by a military governor rather than by their local nobility. And the military governor reported directly to the main cities of the empire. They were putting into place officials in a number of levels in different places within the empire. And really, they were building infrastructure. This same model argues that they were relatively collective in the sense that they were also providing benefits back to their conquered people in the sense of organizing large-scale building projects, providing officials, judges, market supervisors, and so on. But I would argue the primary issue with this theory is that it mixes imperial and local government strategies. It's actually a fairly accurate representation of the way individual Aztec city-states and neighborhoods within them functioned. But most of the benefits that were being given back to the population, or that the population was getting from living in a state-level society, were being provided by the local level authorities and not by the empire itself. Which sort of leaves this as an open question as how do we characterize Aztec rule? And one of the things I would like to bring up here is that there's a lot of geographic variation in the strategies that the empire used. They enforced much more direct control on the center of the empire and had a lot lighter touch as you moved out toward the edges of the empire, including around a lot of the edge of the empire. There's what we would probably call client states in the old world, nominally independent states who were effectively being brought under Aztec control. Within this framework, the Toluca Valley is relatively close to the basin of Mexico. As I said, it's just the next major valley over. They certainly had a long history of interaction with each other. One of the many states that preceded the Aztec Empire may well have controlled parts of the Toluca Valley. And there were probably two, besides the fact it was there were probably two primary reasons for the Aztec conquest of the Toluca Valley. And these would have been the fact that the Aztecs wanted a buffer against the Tarascan Empire, who were their main competition in West Mexico, and the Toluca Valley sits squarely in between the two states. And the Aztecs really sort of went through the Toluca Valley in an attempt to get to the Tarascans, ended up owning it, and decided they were keeping it as a buffer. And the other reason behind the Aztec conquest of the Toluca Valley is that it is a very agriculturally productive area and could provide additional foodstuffs to the growing population of the Basin of Mexico, and an overflow area where you could settle people from the Basin of Mexico, which was getting very close to reaching its carrying capacity by the late Aztec period. I've been referring to the area as the Toluca Valley, which is its modern name. The Aztec term for the area is Matlatzinco, or place of the Matlatzinca, place of the people who use nets. This gets slightly confusing because the Matlatzinca, in the sense of a modern ethnic group, indigenous ethnic group, are only one of several people who live in Matlatzinco in the sense of a geographic region. The area is or traditionally strongly multi-ethnic with multiple overlapping linguistic groups, the three largest of which are Otomi, Mazawa, and Matlatzinca. All three of these are Otomanguean languages, which is a completely different language family from the Uto-Aztecan Nahuatl that the Aztec Empire spoke. So you had not only had these three primary languages for the Toluca Valley overlapping, then as the Aztec Empire came in, you also had additional settlers who spoke Nahuatl moving into the area. Interestingly, under Spanish rule, Nahuatl became the primary indigenous language in the region, despite the fact it was a relatively late introduced language. The area is significantly culturally different than the Basin of Mexico, and this is something we did not realize, or I did not realize going into work there, was just how dramatically different it was going to be culturally, both in terms of some of the big things and some of the small things, because it is traditionally drawn in and considered part of the greater Aztec sphere in central Mexico. Because of the long history of interaction, the geographic proximity, the climatic similarity. But you get an entire range of differences, both in public aspects of culture and in relatively private ones. So you have differences in the layout of both public and private architecture, how commoner houses are built, in the public displays, so types of public sculpture, quite a bit of difference in the ceramic traditions between the two areas, and even differences in mortuary practices. I would say going in, I probably would have predicted the three aspects of this that I have outlined here. We probably could have taken a solid guess that these three aspects of the pottery were going to be different, but the rest of these have largely been findings that have come out of the two projects I'm discussing. One of the consequences of all of these differences is that it would have been very visible when either Aztec immigrants moved into the Toluca Valley, or when local people started adopting Aztec practices. You couldn't just incidentally buy a decorated Aztec pot at the market. bring it home and go, oh, I didn't notice that was an Aztec one. They are stylistically distinct enough that it was obvious what kind of choice you were making. So the Aztec Empire conquered the Toluca Valley for the first time in 1477. There were several subsequent revolts, and so cities in the Toluca Valley turn up on the conquest lists of three sequential Aztec emperors. It was a fairly common thing that when you got a new emperor, anybody who wanted to try and split away from the empire would test the resolve of the new guy in charge. And the Toluca Valley certainly tried that repeatedly. Here you could see the glyphs. I said Matlatzinco means place of the people of the nets, and in both cases, the conquered Matlatzinco warrior here is showing a net glyph. This is also an area where we have unusually good information about how the Aztec Empire divided things up after they conquered it. And this is also an interesting window into the way the Aztec Empire ruled their provinces, because on the tribute lists, the entire Toluca Valley pretty much appears as one province. When the Spanish collected more detailed information for a number of court cases, mainly because the Spanish crown was trying to sue Hernan Cortes for a bunch of his lands, and a bunch of the local communities decided they were going to try and use this for their own benefit to get out from tax burdens one way or the other. It produced an absolutely lovely documentary record. What we have learned is that the towns of the Toluca Valley were divided up into four different categories. So some of them were assigned as to pay their tribute, their taxes, to cities in the Triple Alliance, the three key capitals of the Aztec Empire. Some of them were assigned to pay their taxes, their tribute to other cities in the basin of Mexico who had assisted with the conquest of the region. Some of them were assigned to pay their tribute directly to individual sections of the Mexica royal house, so particular lineages within the Aztec emperor's family, broader family. And a few of them stayed under the control of the local nobility. Within this, the two sites we'll be looking at, Kish Lawaka fell directly under the control of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. Tlacotepec is actually a mystery. It does not appear in the tribute lists. It appears on the conquest lists for the Aztec Empire. So it clearly existed as a site. It occurs in the earliest Spanish record, so it continued to be a site. And somehow they weaseled out of the tribute lists. And someday I will figure that one out. Actually, I should detail it. They appear on one of the two extant versions of the Aztec tribute lists, but it is almost certainly a mistake because the same glyph is given a different name on the other version of the tribute list, which is more likely to be the right one. Both of them are towns that were later called Santiago something or other. One became Santiago Tlacotepec and one became Santiago Miltepec. And I'm fairly sure there was a Spanish scribe who went, that one's Santiago whatchamacallit over in the Toluca Valley. And they got it wrong on one of them. So the Toluca Valley ended up wildly subdivided among alliances or under the control of different parts, different city-states in the basin of Mexico at one level, and unified as a single province of the Aztec Empire at another, which likely had fairly variable effects on the different cities within the region. The first of these that we'll be looking at is called Kish Lawaka. Kish Lawaka was the largest city and likely controlled much of the Toluca Valley prior to the Aztec conquest of the area. It was abandoned probably by 1530 or so, within 10 to 20 years of the Spanish conquest, under the Congregacion policy that moved native communities who were being affected by disease, consolidated them into particular surviving towns. Between 2006 and 2012, the Kish Lawaka Archaeological Project, of which my dissertation work was part of, completed a full survey of the site, excavations of, I think it's 27 locations across the site, and all of the associated artifact analysis. Completely accidentally, we ended up with 6 excavated houses dating to each of the 3 phases. We wanted some that came from each period, but getting a perfectly balanced sample was a complete accident and not something we realized until after we completed the seriation, long after we were out of the field. But it produces a great sample for looking at change over time, where you can use the difference between the first 2 time periods to figure out what was going on before the Aztec Empire came into the site, and then the 3rd period to figure out how that trajectory changed as a result of Aztec conquest. This is what the site looks like today. As we go through a few of the pictures of the 2 sites, you will definitely notice there is a very distinct rainy season and dry season in the Toluca Valley. This is clearly a wet season picture. Like most sites in the Toluca Valley, Kish Lawaka has a hill at its center and scattered groups of monumental architecture up and down it. You can actually see one of them in the background here. That's one of the restored pyramids at the site. There's another, it's got 7 or 8 small clusters of monumental architecture that run all the way from the valley floor to the top of the hill. This is very characteristic of the Toluca Valley, as opposed to Basin of Mexico Aztec sites, which have a single central monumental core, where all of the key buildings are concentrated together, and they don't usually have a hill in the middle of them. During the period it was occupied, the bulk of the site would have been terraced and covered with small houses. If you're ever in central Mexico and want to go visit, the site is open to the public. It has a very nice little site museum at it. Though it can be a bit of an adventure trying to figure out where all of those scattered monumental groups of architecture are up and down the hill, because there really aren't marked trails. Some of the more interesting bits of public architecture at the site are the Structure 17, which is the local ruling family's palace. It's a very stereotypical Central Mexican Postclassic palace. There's a courtyard, large courtyard with a set of large platforms on 2 sides of it, and then a set of small rooms that were a combination of family residences and storerooms and training rooms for classes or other public activities. So in this regard, this is one of the areas where the Toluca Valley does fit within the broader canon of expected cultural traditions in central Mexico, which says something about the level to which perhaps the nobility were interacting with other parts of central Mexico, as opposed to the level at which the commoner majority of the population was interacting with the rest of the population of central Mexico prior to the Aztec conquest. One of the other fun structures at Kish Lawaka is structure 3, which is a round pyramid. And these are relatively unusual in post-classic central Mexico. They turn up earlier during the two major periods earlier during the formative. And then there are some small ones elsewhere in the Aztec world. But they are traditionally associated with Quetzalcoatl Ejecat. So Quetzalcoatl as the wind god Ejecat. And this was actually very clearly the case in this case, because they found he's slightly more than life-size sculpture of the wind god in the fill between the construction episodes of this pyramid in the 1930s when it was excavated. So there had been previous work at Kish Lawaka in the 1930s, which was very much conducted 1930s style, focused on the monumental architecture and reconstruction and very broad patterns of cultural influence and change. They found the sculpture. They did not realize how unique he was until much later. He's Aztec imperial style. So this guy was made, or almost certainly made, by a sculptor trained in the workshops that made the sculptures for the rulers of the Aztec Emperor. There's some very distinctive things, such as how they make the sandals and the little folds around the knees. So this was something made out of local stone, but by an incredibly well-trained imperial sculptor, and left in a sort of a secondary provincial temple. He's a bit of a mystery. But he does show the higher level of interaction between the nobility at Kish Lawaka and the nobility of other parts of central Mexico, including the Aztec Empire. So I have a few pictures of the excavations here. So we looked at the pyramids, a sense of what the monumental architecture looks at like at the site. Honestly, for something that was the capital, probably a regional level capital, the monumental architecture at Kish Lawaka is relatively modest. These are examples of commoner houses that we excavated during the project. The one on the bottom is a good example of multiple small rooms around a paved courtyard. Unfortunately, because of the way the terracing at the site collapsed, you tend to get the upslope half of every room. And so what you have here is one room, a central patio, a second room, and the upslope half of a third room. But these were pretty typical throughout the three periods, that the houses look pretty similar. Most of them appear to have been made out of wattle and daub, rather than the adobe that is more common in the basin of Mexico. And we can actually say that because several of them burned fairly catastrophically, and we have a lot of preserved daub. Which brings us back around to looking at the things that we might be able to say about rulership and what changes over time at the site with the Aztec conquest. So ceramics, I'm a ceramicist. We're going to have shared pictures here. I'm sorry. The ceramic traditions of the Basin of Mexico are fairly distinctive from those of the Toluca Valley. So you get orange wares and red wares. In the Basin of Mexico, you get red on buff, which I can also make jokes about the fact I have worked in multiple time periods and multiple regions, and it's always red on buff pottery. I can't escape it. You also get some polychromes and your other major set of ceramic imports you get in the region, outside of those from the Basin of Mexico, are those that come from areas to the south and southwest, which include some red on whites and some incised red wares. There are very clear temporal trends in who's trading with who. So one of these shows the INAA-based changes in whether your imports are coming from the Basin of Mexico or areas on the other side of the Toluca Valley, and they basically switch over time. The other one shows just the visual type-based identification, which actually gave fairly similar proportions. So you go from having the majority of your non-local ceramics coming from areas in West Mexico or toward West Mexico to having the majority of your imported ceramics coming from the Aztec Empire, from the Basin of Mexico. However, this is a change that you'll note starts during the Nanupi period, the middle graph here, and that's before the Aztec Empire conquers the area. So the economic and cultural shifts are predating the military political shifts. The other thing that we can see in the pottery is the amount of variation you get among households. So this shows the proportion of imported ceramics. Each bar is a household from that time period. And yes, you see the overall shifting pattern in the average, but there's also quite a bit of variation in how many imports and where they're coming from among the households that date to the same time period. And as far as we can tell, these are all commoner households, so you're not seeing a status-based difference here in how many imports or where people are importing from. And if you'll remember when I was talking about types of rule, one of the things you look for is how evenly the changes are spread across society. So here it looks like people are getting quite a bit of leeway to opt in or out of using more Aztec stuff. We can also look at the flaked stone assemblage at the site. So at Aztec sites, over 90% of the flaked stone assemblage is obsidian, and it is traded very widely across central Mexico. At most Aztec sites in the Basin of Mexico and other parts of the Aztec heartland, 80 to 90% of the obsidian will come from a single source, one called Pachuca. This is coincidentally also a very easy source to visually identify because it is sort of champagne bottle dark green. It's very distinctive. So both people in the past could have basically used it as a quality assurance that, yes, we know where that obsidian is coming from and we know it's high quality obsidian. But the archaeologists could also visually source it without having to resort to XRF. Though, if we're being responsible, we always test a few pieces to make sure it's actually coming from where we think it's coming from. And we did at Kush Lawaka, and it is. But at Kush Lawaka, as opposed to the 80 to 90% it makes up at most sites, it's a much lower frequency. It's about 20 to 30%, which I realize didn't actually show on the graphs here. Over time, you get two patterns. One, this is the proportion of flaked stone or obsidian from different sources relative per thousand, standardized per thousand sherds. And under Aztec rule, you actually get a reduction in obsidian from all sources. So obsidian becomes much more restricted. But that drop is much sharper in sources that aren't controlled by the Aztec Empire. So they're putting a bottleneck on stone being traded from outside the empire. And you also see a significant reduction, probably because of that lack of raw material in the amount of evidence for flake stone production under the Aztec Empire. You see the opposite pattern with textile production, which goes up very sharply under Aztec rule by that third period. So it was already increasing, like the ceramics, you're already seeing increased economic integration prior to the military political conquest. But textile production goes up very sharply. This is probably because one of the most common items that you paid your taxes in the Aztec world, paid your tribute in, were standardized links of cloth. So this was almost certainly at least a partial response to Aztec taxes. And this is one of the ones I find the most interesting because up to this point, I've largely been looking at economic changes, though you could argue that the changes in decorated pottery also had a lot to do with changing taste and changing aesthetics, cultural preferences. But you also see a change in foodways under Aztec rule. So both areas grow the traditional Three Sisters, corn, beans, squash with some amaranth. There's some variation in particular seasoning crops. But there seems to be a major difference between the two areas in how they process corn, that there are effectively no comals, no tortilla griddles in the Toluca Valley prior to the Aztec conquest. What you do get are what we call interior incised ollas, big wide-mouthed jars with scoring on the inside. It's very rough scoring. They're not grinding bowls. Those are separate. And they seem to vary inversely with the presence of comals. Once comals are present, a household will have a lot of comals or a lot of interior incised jars, but not both. They're probably tamale steaming pots. And what we're seeing is the switch from primarily corn preparation as tamales to at least some corn preparation as tortillas, though the frequency of comals is still way lower than it is anywhere else in the Aztec heartland. So you're dealing with major culinary changes as well as economic changes. So that provides an overview of the level of change we can see at a site with excavation and a really solid seriation and an ability to track changes related to Aztec conquest through time. But as I finished my work there, I was really wondering whether Kush Lawaka was a representative site. It was the largest, most important site in the region. If there was anywhere that was going to have evidence of Aztec influence and change, it probably was going to be Kush Lawaka. So a few years ago, as a postdoc project, I got a grant to go back and look at one of the other city-state capitals in the Toluca Valley. So Tlacotepec was a fairly small city-state capital, but it was the capital of an independent city. As I brought up before, the relationship to the Aztec Empire is uncertain. It appears on the conquest lists, but not on the tribute lists. So somebody clearly was very good at cutting a deal somewhere in there. And in contrast to Kush Lawaka, which was largely abandoned under Spanish congregación policy, Tlacotepec remained a native settlement under traditional rule, known as a Pueblo de Indios. So the traditional nobility largely stayed in charge, though they became elected officials within a Spanish-style town council system. The site has, I should say the site, the village has remained continuously occupied through the present day, so there's no hiatus in occupation. And it actually has one of the earlier churches in the Toluca Valley. It was built within about 20 years of the Spanish conquest. This was a project that went through a lot of wandering to get into the field. I actually found out I received the grant the week before everyone was sent home for the first of the COVID-19 quarantines. And the project then got put on hold for about 2 years before it could actually get fielded. It was a full coverage collection survey of the site, no excavation. So here we're working primarily with surface data and spatial patterns. We found that the site does very much conform to the Toluca Valley patterns. So these are a couple examples of the unrestored monumental architecture at the site, since unlike Kush Lawaka, there's no formal archaeological zone, and the only prior quote-unquote archaeological work was some fairly serious looting in the late 1800s, which actually resulted in just about every collection of Toluca Valley or Montlatsinca ceramics held at a U.S. museum came out of Tlacotepec in the late 1800s. So it's very well represented in U.S. museum collections, and there's no formal archaeological work there, which was actually one of the reasons for picking the site, to get some background for some of the museum collections. Here you can see one mound group behind our lovely field crew here, and then a second one. It was burned off before the farmers planted for the year. And one of the most straightforward ways to look at Aztec influence at the site is just to compare the numbers for some of the markers that we were just looking at for Kush Lawaka. So the frequency of decorated Aztec ceramics, the frequency of tortilla griddles, the proportion of green obsidian at the site, and the frequency of spinning tools. And these are really a mixed bag, because there are far fewer decorated Aztec ceramics at the site than you would expect, as you'd expect Tlacotepec which probably has a similar occupation span, possibly one that starts a little bit earlier than Kush Lawaka, to sort of look like the average of the three periods at Kush Lawaka. And you've got far fewer Aztec decorated wares, about as many comals as you'd expect, about a bit more green obsidian than you would expect, and about as many textile production tools as you'd expect. So this produces a very mixed picture of Aztec influence sort of down the settlement hierarchy. The other piece that comes into play here is the way that influence is distributed across the site. At Kush Lawaka, there is no particular spatial patterning in where Aztec households with more evidence of Aztec influence appear. This actually drove my dissertation sister, who analyzed the survey data, up the wall because she could not get patterns out of it. Whereas at Tlacotepec, there actually is relatively clear patterning, that the Aztec-associated ceramics tend to occur around the edges of the hill, around the base of the hill. And similarly, a disproportionate amount of the green obsidian also occurs on the valley floor or around the edges of the hill. And this is a pattern that suggests that it's relatively late in the site's history. If there were Aztec settlers, they were at the periphery of the site. And actually, what may be occurring here, and this is one where I'd like to go back and excavate to check, since it's speculation at this point, is that what appear to be Aztec-linked artifacts may actually largely be occurring during the very early Spanish colonial period. There are most of what appears as Aztec diagnostics at Tlaquehuatepec are actually things, ceramic types for the most part, that occurred both during the last several decades of the Aztec Empire and during the first several decades of the Spanish Empire. And so it would be a very interesting case here to see if there is actually very minimal Aztec influence and under Aztec rule, and significantly more Aztec influence under Spanish rule, which would be a very unexpected situation. So bring this back around, the Aztec conquest of the Toluca Valley, particularly of Kush Lawaka, had some effects on the majority of the population, but they really honestly weren't that big. Even when we were looking at the highest levels of imported Aztec ceramics, that was maybe 10% of the household ceramic assemblage. The overwhelming majority was still local, and most Aztec ceramics appear to be being integrated into local patterns of use. They're still being used the same way local ceramics are. There are some economic changes, probably modestly negative, but not significantly so. The overall pattern here is probably relatively collective governance prior to Aztec rule, which I brought up that a lot of the goods and services that get attributed to the Aztec Empire in more collective models are actually provided at the local level. And this looks like it's the case here, that there's pretty homogeneous assemblages, household assemblages, before the Aztec conquest. And that Aztec rule is probably less collective, relying more on elites and standing out as different rather than trying to get the local population to buy into being Aztec. And probably relatively indirect rule. So what the Aztecs were learning as they moved into the Toluca Valley was that the empire did not need to look nearly as culturally homogenous as it had up to that point. And the really shifting, it's the pivot point between the more modern model, the idea that the Aztec Empire was relatively collective and somewhat more direct, and the older model that it largely left people alone as long as they paid their taxes. And the Toluca Valley seems to fall in between these two, but it was the Aztec Empire learning as they expanded out that they were not going to be able to maintain the same level of control in their more distant provinces. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge everyone who's worked on both of these projects. They have been very much a team effort, from community support in both of the local communities to the crews that have worked on them over many years, the funding institutions, and many of the groups that have provided local infrastructural support for us in Mexico. And thanks to all of you for listening to me this evening.
Thank you, Angela, Dr. Huster. That was very interesting. We have two questions. One is in the chat, and the other one is in the Q&A section. So if you want to take a look at those.
Okay, yeah, let me stop my sharing here. Okay. Okay, let me see. What insights can you share about Poshteca intentions and methods of influence? Oh, that's a good question. So the Poshteca are Aztec merchant guilds based in a number of cities in central Mexico, in the basin of Mexico. Um, they were semi-state sponsored in the sense that they made sure that a lot of the luxury goods that the empire needed made it back, and often served as spies and informants for the Aztec Empire. Uh, they were only, however, one of an entire range of merchants operating in the Aztec world, that they were, you might say, the elite of the merchants, but there were also local and regional merchants who operated outside of the Poshteca system. Um, at Kish Lawaka, honestly, we don't see a lot of evidence for the types of goods that the Poshteca specialized in at either of these sites. The Toluca Valley was largely known for the production of bulk staples, corn, beans, and agave textiles, none of which were particularly high value or likely would have been particularly attractive to the Poshteca. Uh, Let me see here. My other question here is, what explains Aztec martial success and continued military control? That's also a good one, because the Aztec Empire really didn't have a significant technological advantage over most of the people they were conquering. It was comparable armor, comparable spear, projectile points. They probably had modestly better military organization and perhaps a more formal, organized permanent military leadership. The bulk of most Mesoamerican armies were peasants doing labor service for their city state, and maybe you went out and dug ditches, maybe you cultivated the Lord's fields, maybe if they were going to war that year, you got drafted into the army. And the Aztecs did have a bit more formal training regime there. But I think a lot of it was momentum, that once they started winning, people were willing to ally with them, and then they were able to field progressively larger forces than anyone else could.
All right, thank you. I think we got one more question that came in.
And okay.
There you go.
What would the boundary between the Aztec and the Tarascan empires be like? Another good one. So there have been several archaeologists who have worked along that border and identified a series of forts. The Aztec ones I find particularly interesting because they are intrusive into local cultures. You can see the underlying local, say Chontal, or not Chontal, local groups. You can see the Aztec garrisons, and then on the other side of the line, you can see the Tarascan garrisons. So it was a fortified frontier. You can see sort of the ceramic and the obsidian distribution patterns. It's a fairly clear frontier. That said, the official party line on both sides was that there was absolutely no trade across the Aztec-Tarascan border, other than one or two official parties that went back and forth every year. And one of the things that the Toluca Valley sites show, particularly Kush Lawaka, is that that wasn't really the case. I said that there was a dramatic reduction in the amount of obsidian coming in from outside the Aztec Empire after they took over, but it was nowhere near zero. I think it's still about 20% of the obsidian is coming from Tarascan controlled sources. So it's presumably black market obsidian. Um, I'd be, one of those things, if I ever had a time machine, going back and interviewing an Aztec obsidian smuggler would be a great opportunity. I suspect part of it was based on family ties, especially in the Toluca Valley, because when the Aztecs came in, some people from the Toluca Valley actually fled across the border into the Tarascan Empire, where the Tarascans set them up as buffer populations, buffer towns along the edge of the empire on the Tarascan side. And clearly, those people would have still had family connections to people in the Toluca Valley, and I suspect a lot of the trade was running back and forth along those lines rather than anything official.
Okay, any more questions? If not, we're gonna shut it down for tonight. I want to thank everybody for participating. The May lecture, it's already on YouTube. I'm hoping to have this lecture on YouTube by the weekend. So please join us next month. Dr. Forrest, she's going to be talking about technological land, right? I think. So it's
Teotihuacan.
Teotihuacan.
So you get to jump back several hundred years in Mesoamerican history.
So yeah, please join us for that next month. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Huster. Goodbye.